Rejection is usually experienced as a wound, a signal that something is wrong with us, something lacking, something unchosen. But Jung understood rejection very differently. He saw it not only as an emotional event, but as a psychological interruption, an interruption of projection. When someone rejects you, they are no longer carrying the image your psyche placed upon them. And this collapse of projection, while painful, has a strange side effect. It returns energy to you. Before rejection, a significant amount of psychic energy flows outward, toward approval, toward being seen, toward being chosen. Rejection stops that flow abruptly. At first, this feels like loss. But psychologically, it is a redirection. The energy that was invested in the other has nowhere to go, but back into the self. Jung believed that attractiveness is not created by pursuit, but by presence. And presence increases when attention returns inward. After rejection, many people unconsciously collapse. They interpret the event as a verdict on their worth. But others, often without realizing it, begin to reorganize. They stop performing. They stop adjusting. They stop orienting themselves around an external gaze. This shift is subtle, but it is felt. Rejection forces differentiation. You are no longer who you were. When you were trying to be chosen, you become more defined. Defined people are attractive because they radiate coherence. Jung understood that coherence is sensed unconsciously. It is not about confidence displays or emotional distance. It is about inner alignment. When rejection disrupts illusion, it can push you closer to who you actually are. This is why rejection sometimes makes someone more compelling afterward, not because they changed strategy, but because they stopped leaking energy. They are no longer asking silently, "Do you see me? Am I enough?" That question dissolves, and when it dissolves, something steadier appears. Self-containment. Jung believed self-containment was one of the most magnetic psychological states. It signals that a person is in relationship with themselves. Another important shift occurs in how desire is experienced. Before rejection, desire is often mixed with dependency. After rejection, desire becomes cleaner. It is no longer fueled by hope of validation. It becomes expression rather than need. This changes how others respond. People are drawn not to need, but to vitality. Rejection, when integrated, returns vitality. Not immediately, not without discomfort, but gradually. As the psyche reclaims itself, you become less reactive, less available to manipulation, less eager to be defined by another's choice. Jung understood that autonomy is deeply attractive because it signals psychological maturity. Maturity does not chase. It does not withdraw dramatically either. It stands, and standing changes the field around you. People sense when someone is no longer trying to be impressive, when someone is simply present. This presence alters interactions. Conversations deepen. Boundaries clarify. Eye contact changes, not because of technique, but because of internal reorganization. Rejection initiates this reorganization. When it is not resisted, when it is allowed to teach, rather than humiliate. And this is where its hidden power lies. Not in proving anything to the one who rejected you, but in activating something that was dormant before. Something grounded, something centered, something quietly attractive, because it no longer needs permission to exist. As this inner reorganization continues, the individual begins to notice a shift in how they relate to silence. Silence after rejection is no longer filled with self-criticism. It becomes reflective. Jung believed silence was where the unconscious reorganizes itself. When external validation disappears, the psyche is forced to establish an inner reference point. This is uncomfortable at first. Without the other's attention, you meet yourself more directly. Your habits, your expectations, your unexamined assumptions about worth. But this encounter is not destructive. It is clarifying. You begin to see how much of your behavior was shaped by anticipation. Anticipation of response. Anticipation of approval. Anticipation of being mirrored. Rejection removes the mirror. And without the mirror, you are left with presence. Presence exposes incoherence quickly. Anything false feels exaggerated. Anything authentic feels grounding. This is why some people feel lost after rejection, and others feel strangely more solid. The difference lies in whether the ego tries to replace the lost validation immediately, or allows the psyche to recalibrate. Jung understood that attraction is not generated by filling absence quickly, but by tolerating it consciously. When absence is tolerated, desire reorganizes. It stops scanning outward and begins to settle inward. This settling creates gravity. Gravity is attractive, not because it pulls aggressively, but because it holds. Another shift occurs in how boundaries are experienced. Before rejection, boundaries may have been flexible, even porous. After rejection, they become clearer, not rigid, but defined. You no longer over-explain. You no longer overextend. You no longer overinvest prematurely. This restraint is not a tactic. It is a consequence of regained self-orientation. Jung believed that restraint was misunderstood as coldness by those who confuse attraction with availability. But true attraction responds to containment. Containment signals inner order. Another subtle transformation appears in how rejection is remembered. It stops being a humiliation and becomes a turning point, not because the pain was imagined, but because its meaning has shifted. Meaning reorganizes memory, and reorganized memory no longer drains energy. Energy returns to creativity, to curiosity, to presence in the moment. You begin to occupy space differently. Your posture changes. Your timing changes. Your attention sharpens. These are not conscious strategies. They are expressions of internal realignment. Jung believed that the psyche communicates its state through the body long before the mind explains it. This is why others may respond differently to you after rejection, not because you became distant, but because you became centered. Centered people do not seek. They invite. And invitation is subtle. It does not demand. It allows. This allowance shifts the relational field. People sense it. They may not know why, but they feel it. And this feeling, this quiet sense of grounded presence, is often what makes rejection, paradoxically, the beginning of deeper attraction. As this centered state stabilizes, a deeper psychological effect emerges. The individual stops measuring themselves through relational outcomes. Success is no longer defined by being wanted, and failure is no longer defined by being rejected. Jung believed this shift marked a critical stage in individuation. When the psyche no longer depends on external affirmation, it begins to express itself more authentically. Authenticity is not a performance. It is the absence of performance. After rejection, many people unknowingly remove their masks. They stop editing themselves to fit an imagined expectation. This removal can feel risky, but psychologically, it creates resonance. Resonance occurs when inner experience and outer expression align. People are drawn to resonance because it feels real. Another important transformation happens in how time is experienced. Before rejection, time may have felt urgent. Messages waited for. Responses analyzed. Moments overinterpreted. After rejection, time slows. Not because nothing matters, but because nothing is being chased. Jung saw urgency as a sign of unconscious possession. When the ego is possessed by desire, it loses perspective. Rejection breaks possession. Perspective returns. With perspective, patience becomes possible. And patience is deeply attractive, because it signals confidence in process. Another layer unfolds. In how desire relates to identity. Desire no longer defines who you are. You are not diminished, because someone did not choose you. This decoupling is profoundly liberating. Liberation releases energy. Energy creates vitality. Vitality is magnetic, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a steady, embodied presence. Jung believed that attraction operates largely below consciousness. People feel drawn to those who are at ease within themselves. After rejection, if the wound is integrated, ease increases, not because the pain disappears, but because it is no longer resisted. Resistance creates tension. Integration creates flow. Flow changes how you move, how you speak, how you listen. Listening deepens. You are no longer listening to confirm your value. You listen to understand. This alone transforms interactions. People feel seen without being evaluated. They feel space around you. Space is attractive. Another subtle effect appears in how expectations dissolve. You stop imagining outcomes. You meet moments as they are. This presence dissolves manipulation. There is nothing to manage, nothing to control. Jung believed that control was a compensation for insecurity. When insecurity lessens, control relaxes. Relaxation invites connection. This does not guarantee that the one who rejected you returns. That is not the point. The deeper effect is that you become available to relationships that meet you where you actually are. Rejection clears illusions. Illusions consume energy. When they fall away, what remains is clarity. And clarity, quiet, grounded, embodied clarity, is one of the most compelling qualities a person can carry. No announcement required. No effort displayed. It simply radiates from someone who has stopped seeking permission to exist. As this clarity settles into the psyche, another transformation begins to take shape. The individual starts to notice how much of their previous attraction was fueled by imagination rather than reality. Rejection interrupts fantasy, and when fantasy dissolves, attention returns to what is actually present. This return sharpens perception. You begin to see people more clearly, without overlaying them with unmet needs or projected hopes. Jung believed projection was the greatest obstacle to genuine connection. When projection weakens, discernment strengthens. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy, or pursuit with purpose. This shift changes your emotional economy. Energy that was once invested in anticipation, worry, and self-correction is reclaimed. Reclaimed energy does not disappear. It reorganizes. It moves inward. You may feel moments of stillness that did not exist before. Not emptiness, but quiet fullness. This quiet alters your nervous system. Your body softens. Your breath deepens. Your reactions slow. People sense this before you speak. They feel less pressure around you. Pressure repels. Ease invites. Jung understood that psychological maturity often expresses itself through simplicity. After rejection has been integrated, communication becomes simpler. You say less, but what you say carries weight. You no longer explain yourself excessively. You no longer rush to be understood. Understanding is allowed to emerge, rather than forced. This restraint is not withdrawal. It is groundedness. Groundedness creates trust. Another layer appears in how boundaries form naturally. You no longer need to defend them aggressively. You sense when something does not align, and step back without drama. This non-reactivity is deeply regulating to others. They feel safe in your presence, because you are not trying to take, or prove, or convince. Jung wrote that true power is the ability to remain centered in the presence of emotional charge. Rejection becomes a training ground for this capacity. You have felt the charge and survived it. This survival rewrites your inner narrative. You are no longer afraid of emotional loss. And when fear dissolves, attachment loosens. Loosened attachment allows genuine choice. You engage because you want to, not because you need to. Neediness contracts energy. Choice expands it. This expansion is subtle. It shows up in how you occupy space, how you wait without impatience, how you allow silence to breathe. Silence becomes comfortable, and comfort with silence is a sign of inner alignment. Jung believed alignment was felt more than understood. It is recognized instinctively by others. They may not know why they feel drawn, only that something feels steady. This steadiness is not created by success or approval. It is forged through conscious contact with rejection. And as this steadiness deepens, the psyche begins to reorganize its criteria for attraction itself. You start to feel less compelled by what is unavailable, less fascinated by emotional distance. Something within you recognizes that attraction rooted in lack no longer serves growth. This recognition does not arrive as a rule. It arrives as a feeling, a quiet knowing, and this knowing continues to unfold, reshaping desire from the inside out. As this clarity settles into daily life, another internal shift becomes visible. The person no longer scans the environment for signs of approval or rejection. Attention turns inward, not in a narcissistic way, but in a grounded one. Jung believed that when attention returns to the self, the psyche regains its center of gravity. Before rejection, the center was external, a message, a reaction, a signal. After integration, the center becomes internal. This changes posture, not just psychological, but physical. The body relaxes into itself. Movements slow slightly. Gestures become economical. The voice settles. These changes are subtle, but they are felt by others immediately, because the nervous system communicates long before words do. Another transformation unfolds in how boundaries are experienced. Boundaries no longer feel defensive. They feel natural. You say no without explanation. You say yes without overcommitment. There is no inner negotiation about worth. Jung saw healthy boundaries as a sign of a differentiated ego. Differentiation means knowing where you end and the other begins. After rejection, this line becomes clearer. You stop merging your identity with someone else's perception. This alone restores dignity. Dignity is deeply attractive, not seductive, not performative, but solid. At the same time, emotional availability increases. This may seem paradoxical, but when you are no longer afraid of losing yourself, you can meet others more openly. You no longer approach connection with hunger. You approach it with curiosity. Curiosity is lighter than need. Need pulls. Curiosity invites. Jung believed that psychic energy flows toward what is approached freely. Compulsion blocks flow. Freedom restores it. Another subtle effect appears in how rejection is remembered. It no longer defines a narrative of inadequacy. It becomes information. Information without judgment. This reframing alters memory itself. The past loses its charge. And when the past loses charge, the present opens. Presence deepens. You begin to notice details again. Tone, rhythm, silence. You are no longer rehearsing how to be perceived. You are responding. Responsiveness creates aliveness. Aliveness is sensed instinctively by others. Jung believed that attraction is often a response to psychological vitality. Vitality emerges when energy is no longer bound to unconscious conflict. Rejection, when integrated, frees that energy. This does not make someone invulnerable. Sensitivity remains, but it is no longer dangerous. Pain can be felt without collapsing identity, and this capacity to feel without dissolving marks psychological maturity. Maturity shifts how intimacy unfolds. You do not rush. You do not cling. You do not withdraw prematurely. You allow space for things to reveal themselves. Space creates depth. Depth cannot be faked, and those who encounter it often cannot explain why it feels compelling. They simply feel calmer, more present, more themselves, in your presence. And this is the quiet paradox Jung pointed to. Rejection does not make you attractive by proving something to others. It makes you attractive by returning you to yourself. And from there, something real begins to move. Rejection is often experienced as a wound to the ego. It feels personal, like a verdict on our worth. But Carl Jung understood rejection very differently. He saw it not as proof of inadequacy, but as a moment where unconscious dynamics are exposed. When someone is rejected, something subtle happens inside the psyche. The immediate impulse is to shrink, to explain, to seek validation. But when a person does not collapse inward after rejection, when they do not chase or plead for approval, the psychological balance shifts. Rejection removes illusion. It strips away projection. And what remains is presence. Jung believed that attraction is not created by effort, but by psychic coherence. People are drawn to those who are internally aligned, not those who are trying to be chosen. Rejection, when integrated consciously, forces a person back into themselves, away from performance, away from self-betrayal, away from dependency on external affirmation. This return creates depth, and depth is magnetic. When someone no longer needs to be accepted, their energy changes. They speak more slowly. They listen more fully. They react less defensively. There is less urgency in their movements, less explanation in their words. This is not indifference. It is groundedness. Jung observed that what we cling to unconsciously begins to control us. Rejection interrupts this unconscious clinging. It exposes where desire has turned into attachment. And once attachment is seen clearly, it loosens. This loosening creates psychological space. And space is attractive, because space allows the other person to approach freely, rather than being pulled by need. Paradoxically, rejection often awakens the very qualities that create attraction: self-reflection, boundaries, inner authority. The rejected person who turns inward instead of outward begins to individuate. They ask different questions. Not, why wasn't I enough? But, what did this reveal about me? Jung believed that the psyche grows when pain is metabolized into meaning. Rejection, when resisted, becomes resentment. When avoided, it becomes insecurity. But when faced consciously, it becomes integration. The individual no longer defines themselves by another's response. They begin to act from internal alignment, rather than emotional hunger. And this shift is felt immediately by others, not because it is dramatic, but because it is real. People sense when someone has stopped chasing and started standing. They sense when desire is no longer asking for permission. Rejection, in this way, returns a person to themselves. And anyone who has returned to themselves carries a quiet confidence. Not loud, not performative, but grounded. And grounded energy does not need to convince. It simply is. Rejection feels like a wound to the ego. But Jung understood something that most people never realize. What wounds the ego can strengthen the psyche. When a person is rejected, something crucial happens internally. The image they held of themselves is interrupted. The mirror they depended on is removed. And this interruption creates space. Most people rush to fill that space immediately. They seek validation, attention, replacement. But when rejection is endured consciously, it produces a very different effect. The person is forced back into themselves. Jung believed that attractiveness does not originate in approval, but in psychic coherence. Rejection strips away false coherence. It dissolves the version of the self that existed only because it was reflected by others. What remains is raw. And rawness, when integrated, becomes presence. A rejected person who does not collapse inward begins to reorganize their inner structure. They stop performing, stop anticipating reactions, stop adjusting their identity to be accepted. This shift is subtle, but it is immediately felt by others, because the psyche recognizes autonomy instinctively. Rejection, when not internalized as shame, activates individuation. The person no longer orbits around being chosen. They begin to orbit around meaning. This is where attractiveness changes its nature. It is no longer about charm or appearance. It becomes density, a kind of groundedness, a sense that this person is no longer seeking permission to exist. Jung observed that people are unconsciously drawn to those who have integrated their shadow. Rejection forces shadow contact. Feelings of inadequacy, anger, grief, envy. When these emotions are denied, they make a person brittle, needy, reactive. But when they are faced, they deepen the personality. Depth is magnetic, not because it demands attention, but because it does not need it. This is why someone who has been rejected and has not rushed to escape the pain often becomes more attractive afterward. They speak less, but with more weight. They listen without scanning for approval. Their presence is not performative. It is contained. Containment is rare, and rarity draws attention. The irony is that the very people who once rejected them often sense this change, not consciously, but instinctively. Something has shifted. The rejected person is no longer reaching outward. They are standing inwardly. And this inward standing alters how energy moves around them. Jung would say that libido has been withdrawn from the object and reinvested in the self. This reinvestment produces solidity, and solidity is deeply attractive because it signals psychological independence. The person is no longer asking, "Am I enough?" They are asking, "What is true?" And truth has a gravity that illusion cannot imitate. Rejection, when understood psychologically, is not a verdict on your worth. It is a confrontation. Carl Jung believed that the psyche grows precisely at the point where it is wounded. When someone rejects you, what collapses is not your value, but the image you were trying to protect. And this collapse is powerful, because the ego loses control. And when the ego loosens its grip, something deeper begins to emerge. At first, rejection feels like loss. Loss of approval. Loss of certainty. Loss of imagined futures. But beneath that loss, a hidden transformation is taking place. You are forced back into yourself. No longer performing. No longer chasing validation. No longer adjusting your identity. To be chosen. This return to the self is what makes rejection paradoxically attractive. Jung understood that true magnetism does not come from trying to be wanted, but from being anchored in oneself. Rejection removes the illusion that your value depends on another's response. And when that illusion dissolves, authenticity appears. You begin to speak more honestly, move more deliberately, desire less approval. Your energy changes, not because you hardened, but because you integrated the wound. People are unconsciously drawn to those who have faced rejection and did not collapse into bitterness or need. They sense inner solidity. This is why rejection, when consciously processed, deepens presence And presence is attractive. Not loud, not performative, but grounded. Jung wrote that whatever is not accepted within is experienced as fate. When rejection is denied, it turns into resentment, obsession, or self-doubt. But when it is accepted, it becomes individuation. You stop asking, "Why wasn't I enough?" and start asking, "Who am I becoming now?" This question changes everything, because attraction no longer comes from seeking attention, but from embodying wholeness. And wholeness does not beg to be chosen. It simply is. At this point, rejection loses its sting. Not because it never happens again, but because it no longer defines you. You understand that being rejected was not a closing of doors, but a redirection inward. And that inward movement is what refines your character, your boundaries, and your capacity to love consciously. This is the secret Jung hinted at. Rejection does not make you less desirable. Unconscious rejection does. But conscious rejection makes you magnetic, because you are no longer trying to be attractive. You are becoming real. If this perspective resonated with you, if it shifted how you see rejection, self-worth, and attraction, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here we explore Carl Jung's psychology, the unconscious forces behind love and identity, and the inner work that transforms pain into strength. Subscribe, and continue this journey into depth, where true attraction begins.